October 14, 1971. Johnny Carson stopped The Tonight Show mid-broadcast to read a letter that arrived from Vietnam. What that soldier wrote in 3 blood-stained pages made Carson go silent for 4 minutes on live television, and 20 million viewers watched him break down completely. The network tried to cut to commercial. Carson refused. What happened next would haunt him for 30 years. The Tonight Show had a rhythm, a pulse that had been beating steadily since October 1962, when Johnny Carson first walked through that curtain and changed late-night television forever. By 1971, it was more than just a show. It was a national ritual, a bedtime story for millions of Americans who needed to laugh after watching Walter Cronkite count the dead from Southeast Asia on the evening news. Carson understood his role perfectly. Make them forget. Make them smile. Give them permission to sleep without nightmares. He was America's secular priest, administering the sacrament of laughter every single night at 11:30. But on that October evening, something arrived that would shatter the rhythm, break the spell, and reveal the man behind the smile in a way that terrified everyone who witnessed it. Before we continue with what happened that night, I need to ask you something. If you want to hear the stories that never made it into the history books, the moments that changed everything but somehow got buried under decades of polished nostalgia, then subscribe to this channel. Because what you're about to discover about Johnny Carson and that letter from Vietnam is just the beginning of a much deeper truth about the man who defined an era. The envelope arrived on Tuesday, October 12th, delivered in the standard military mail batch that NBC received almost daily during the war years. Fan Mail Department Supervisor Margaret Chen would later testify, yes, testify, because there would be an investigation, that she noticed the envelope immediately. Not because of the Da Nang postmark or the military stamps, but because of the weight. 3 pages, standard issue military stationery, but folded around something else. Something that made brown stains seep through the paper. Chen opened it according to protocol, read the first 2 sentences, and immediately walked it to producer Freddie de Cordova's office without processing it through the normal channels. She violated a dozen NBC policies doing that, and she never regretted it for a second. De Cordova read the letter twice. Then he locked it in his desk drawer and didn't mention it to anyone for 48 hours. Years later, in an interview that wouldn't be published until after his death, he explained why. I knew what that letter would do to Johnny. I knew it would break something inside him that might never heal. And I wasn't sure America was ready to see their favorite comedian shattered on live television. But on Thursday afternoon, 6 hours before showtime, de Cordova made a decision that would define his career and change the trajectory of The Tonight Show forever. He took the letter to Carson's private dressing room, placed it on the makeup table without a word, and walked out. Carson was alone when he read it. No witnesses, no cameras, no Ed McMahon telling jokes in the corner to keep the energy up. Just Johnny and 3 pages of cramped handwriting from Private First Class Michael James Henderson, 23 years old, from Modesto, California, writing from a firebase that would be overrun and abandoned 6 weeks after he mailed that letter. What Henderson wrote wasn't a fan letter. It wasn't a request for an autograph or a funny story about watching the show in the rec room. It was a confession, a prayer, and an accusation all folded together, written by a kid who knew he was probably going to die and wanted someone back home to understand what that actually meant. The letter started simply enough. Mr. Carson, you don't know me, but I watch your show every night they let us. Well, not every night. Sometimes we're in the bush and there's no TV. Sometimes we're too tired to care. Sometimes we just saw something that makes your jokes feel like they're coming from another planet. Henderson described his routine, the morning patrols, the afternoon heat that made you feel like you were breathing soup, the evening hours waiting for darkness when the real war began. He talked about his buddy Ramirez, who could do a perfect impression of Ed McMahon, and how that impression was the last thing Ramirez ever did before the sniper round found him during a supply run. He described carrying Ramirez's body back to base and how all he could think about was Ed McMahon's laugh, that big, booming, beautiful laugh that meant everything was okay, everything was going to be fine. But the letter took a turn on page 2, and this is where Carson's hands started shaking when he read it in his dressing room. Henderson wrote, "I need you to understand something, Mr. Carson. When you make your jokes about hippies and protesters and people who don't support the war, some of us laugh, some of us don't. Because I'm starting to think maybe the hippies are right. Maybe the protesters are right. Maybe we're over here dying for something that doesn't make any sense, and back home you're making jokes about it because that's easier than asking the hard questions." The words were blunt, angry, but underneath the anger was something worse, a desperate plea for validation, for someone to acknowledge that his suffering meant something, anything, beyond a punchline in a monologue. The third page was shorter. Henderson's handwriting got shakier, like he was running out of time or courage or both. He wrote about watching the show with his platoon, 12 guys crowded around a small TV in the firebase rec room, and how for 30 minutes they could pretend they were back home, safe, normal. He wrote about how much that meant to them, how Carson's voice was the closest thing to their father's voices, how the familiar rhythm of the show was the only rhythm that made sense in a place where nothing made sense. And then he wrote the sentence that would break Johnny Carson on live television. "We love you, Mr. Carson, even when you don't love us back. And I needed you to know that before I don't get another chance to tell you." Carson sat in his dressing room for 40 minutes, reading those 3 pages over and over. Makeup artist Jill Foster knocked 3 times before he finally opened the door. She took one look at his face and knew something fundamental had changed. He looked older, she would tell biographers decades later. Not tired, older, like he'd aged 5 years in 40 minutes. Carson didn't explain the letter. He didn't show it to her. He just asked her to do his makeup and said, voice absolutely flat, "We're going to do something different tonight." The show started normally enough. The NBC fanfare played. Ed McMahon delivered his legendary introduction. From Hollywood, it's The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. And the audience erupted in applause. Carson walked through that rainbow curtain with his golf swing gesture, smiling that famous smile, and for the first 15 minutes, everything was classic Carson. The monologue killed. Jokes about Nixon, about the new fall TV season, about his recent golf game with Bob Hope. The audience ate it up. 20 million Americans watching from coast to coast had no idea that underneath that polished performance, Johnny Carson was making a decision that would violate every rule of late-night television and possibly destroy his career. During the first commercial break, Carson did something he'd never done before in 9 years of hosting. He walked over to Freddie de Cordova's station offstage and said, voice barely above a whisper, "I'm reading the letter." De Cordova's face went white. "Johnny, you can't. Legal hasn't cleared it. We don't have permission from the soldier. We don't even know if he's—" Carson cut him off. "I'm reading the letter, Freddie. You can cut to commercial if you want, but I'm reading it." Then he walked back to his desk, and de Cordova had about 90 seconds to decide whether to let America's biggest star commit professional suicide on live television or pull the plug and create an even bigger disaster. The show came back from commercial at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Normally, this was when the first guest would be introduced, usually an actress promoting a new movie or a comedian working on new material. Instead, Carson sat alone at his desk with a military envelope in his hands. No introduction, no explanation, just Johnny Carson, silent, staring at 3 folded pages like they might explode. Ed McMahon, sitting in his announcer chair to Carson's right, looked confused. He hadn't been briefed. Doc Severinsen and the band, ready to play the walk-on music for the guest, hesitated. The audience, sensing something was wrong, went completely quiet. Carson looked directly into the camera. Not at the audience in the studio, but through the lens, straight into the living rooms of 20 million Americans. His voice, when he finally spoke, wasn't the smooth professional instrument that had been delivering jokes minutes earlier. It was raw, unsteady, real. "I received a letter this week," he said, "from a soldier in Vietnam. I want to read it to you. I know this isn't what you tuned in for tonight. I know you wanted Johnny Carson the comedian. But right now, I need to be Johnny Carson the human being. And I need you to hear something that I think we've all been avoiding." The network switchboard started lighting up within seconds. NBC executives in New York, it was almost 3 in the morning there, received emergency calls from the West Coast control room. Legal department staff were pulled from their beds. Standards and practices went into panic mode. But in Burbank, California, in Studio One, Johnny Carson started reading Michael Henderson's letter, and nothing in late-night television was ever the same again. He read slowly, carefully, making sure every word landed. When he got to the part about Ramirez doing the Ed McMahon impression, Carson's voice cracked and he had to pause. Ed McMahon, hearing his name in this context for the first time, went absolutely still in his chair. The studio audience was silent in a way that audiences aren't supposed to be silent during The Tonight Show. Not the anticipatory silence before a punchline, but the heavy, awful silence of people who know they're witnessing something they're not supposed to see. Carson kept reading. When he reached the second page, where Henderson questioned the war and called out Carson's jokes about protesters, several people in the audience gasped audibly. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was confrontation, confession, truth being spoken in a space designed for lies that make you laugh. The final page broke him. When Carson read Henderson's line, "We love you, Mr. Carson, even when you don't love us back," his voice disappeared completely. He sat there, on live television, unable to speak, tears streaming down his face, while 20 million Americans watched the mask crack and fall away. 4 minutes and 17 seconds of silence. The director, Bobby Quinn, frantically signaled to cut to commercial. Freddie de Cordova stood frozen, unable to make the call. Ed McMahon started to stand up, instinctively moving to rescue his friend, but something stopped him. Maybe the look on Carson's face, maybe the understanding that this moment was too important to interrupt, too real to smooth over with a joke or a subject change. Finally, Carson folded the letter, placed it carefully on his desk, and looked back at the camera. His face was destroyed, red eyes, tears, the careful makeup running in streaks. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every person in that studio and every person watching at home heard him perfectly. I don't know if Private Henderson is watching tonight. I don't know if he's still alive. But if you are, Michael, if you're out there, I want you to know that I heard you. We all heard you. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every joke I made that hurt you. I'm sorry for using laughter as an excuse not to think about what you're going through. I'm sorry for being afraid of the truth. Then he did something that had never happened before on The Tonight Show. He looked at the audience and said, "We're going to take a break now. When we come back, I don't know what we're going to do, but it won't be the same show we started with tonight." The director cut to commercial, and in those 3 minutes of local advertisements for used cars and laundry detergent, the entire staff of The Tonight Show stood in various stages of shock, trying to process what had just happened. Ed McMahon walked over to Carson's desk. According to everyone who was there that night, he didn't say a word, just put his hand on Johnny's shoulder and stood there while Carson cried. The rest of the show was unlike anything The Tonight Show had broadcast before or would broadcast again. When they came back from commercial, Carson didn't introduce a guest. Instead, he opened the phone lines, something that wasn't technically possible on a live broadcast, but the producers scrambled to make happen anyway, and took calls from veterans, from mothers of soldiers, from protesters, from anyone who needed to speak and be heard. For 45 minutes, The Tonight Show became something it was never designed to be, a space for grief, anger, truth, and the kind of raw human connection that doesn't fit neatly between commercial breaks. One caller, a woman from Ohio named Patricia Breslin, told Carson that her son had been killed in action 3 months earlier, and she'd been watching The Tonight Show every night since then because her son used to watch it, and it made her feel close to him. She thanked Carson for reading Henderson's letter because it was the first time anyone had acknowledged that her son's death meant something beyond a statistic on the evening news. Carson listened, said, "I'm so sorry for your loss," and you could hear in his voice that he meant it with every cell in his body. Another caller, a Marine sergeant calling from Camp Pendleton, told Carson that what he did took more courage than most people would ever understand, and that Henderson's letter spoke for thousands of guys who didn't have the words or the guts to say it themselves. But not everyone was supportive. The network switchboard also received hundreds of calls from angry viewers demanding to know why their entertainment was being hijacked for politics, why Johnny Carson couldn't just stick to jokes and leave the serious stuff to the news programs. NBC received furious letters from sponsors threatening to pull their advertising. The Veterans of Foreign Wars issued a statement condemning Carson for giving a platform to defeatist sentiment and betraying the soldiers who watch his show for escape, not confrontation. Conservative commentators spent the next week eviscerating Carson on their radio programs, calling him a coward, a traitor, a celebrity who betrayed his country for ratings. The backlash was immediate, vicious, and relentless. Johnny Carson never responded publicly to any of it. He didn't issue a statement. He didn't defend himself in interviews. He simply went back to doing The Tonight Show the next night, and every night after that, but something fundamental had shifted. The jokes were still funny. The guests were still entertaining. But there was a weight underneath everything now, an awareness that the smooth surface of late-night comedy was covering something deeper and darker that occasionally needed to break through. Private First Class Michael James Henderson never saw the broadcast. He was killed in action on November 3, 1971, 20 days after Carson read his letter on television. He died during a nighttime mortar attack on firebase Ripcord, which was officially abandoned 6 days later after being deemed indefensible. Henderson was 23 years old. He'd been in Vietnam for 7 months. His body was returned to Modesto, California, and buried with full military honors at Lakewood Memorial Park. His mother, Linda Henderson, received the letter Carson had read. NBC sent it to her with a note from Johnny that simply said, "Your son made me braver. I'm sorry I couldn't return the favor." But here's what America didn't know, what NBC kept buried in the legal files for decades. Michael Henderson wasn't the only soldier who wrote to Carson that year. He was one of 47 servicemen and women who sent letters to The Tonight Show between 1968 and 1973. Letters that expressed doubt, anger, fear, and a desperate need to be heard by someone who represented home. The fan mail department had protocols for handling these letters. Log them, send a generic response, forward particularly concerning ones to military liaison offices. Henderson's letter was different only because it was bloodstained, because the fan mail supervisor broke protocol, because Freddie de Cordova couldn't bring himself to bury it. But what about the other 46? What about the voices that never made it to Carson's desk, that were processed according to procedure and disappeared into filing cabinets? Carson found out about those letters in 1973 after the Paris Peace Accords ended direct U.S. involvement in Vietnam. An assistant producer mentioned them casually during a production meeting, something about fan mail protocols and how they'd been updated after the incident with Henderson's letter. Carson stopped the meeting and demanded to see every single letter that had come from Vietnam. He spent an entire weekend in his dressing room reading them, and on Monday he walked into Freddie de Cordova's office and said, "We failed them. Every single one of them reached out, and we processed them like junk mail." De Cordova tried to explain the legal reasons, the network policies, the impossibility of reading every letter on television. Carson said, "I don't care about the reasons. We failed them." That guilt would shadow Johnny Carson for the rest of his life. In private conversations with close friends, conversations that would only become public years after his death in 2005, Carson returned again and again to Henderson's letter and those 46 other voices he never heard in time. Ed McMahon told biographers that Carson kept a copy of Henderson's letter in his desk drawer for 20 years. And on difficult days, days when the show wasn't working or the ratings dipped or the weight of 30 years in the spotlight felt unbearable, Carson would take out that letter and read it like a reminder of what actually mattered. David Letterman, who considered Carson his mentor and the standard by which all late-night comedy should be measured, said that the Henderson letter story was the single most important lesson Carson ever taught him. Entertainment is a privilege, not a right, and when someone trusts you with their pain, you don't have the luxury of looking away. The long-term impact of that October night rippled through late-night television in ways both obvious and subtle. Directly, it changed nothing. The Tonight Show went back to its normal format. Ratings recovered after a brief dip, and by 1972, it was like the Henderson letter had never happened. But underneath, something fundamental had shifted in how audiences perceived Carson. The myth of the untouchable comedian, the smooth professional who never broke character, had been shattered. America had seen Johnny Carson vulnerable, broken, human, and that created a different kind of trust. Not the trust that comes from consistency, but the trust that comes from knowing that when it really matters, the mask can come off. Other late-night hosts took notice. Dick Cavett, who was Carson's main competition at the time, started incorporating more serious conversations into his show, pushing beyond the standard celebrity interview format to tackle issues that entertainment television usually avoided. Even Johnny himself began taking more risks. Not often, not enough to alienate his core audience, but there were moments scattered through the 70s and 80s where Carson would drop the comedian persona and speak directly about something that mattered. After John Lennon was murdered in 1980, Carson opened the show with a monologue that wasn't funny at all, just a reflection on violence and loss and the fragility of the things we love. After the Challenger disaster in 1986, he did the same. These moments were rare, but they were possible because of what happened with Henderson's letter, because America knew that when necessary, Johnny Carson could be more than just funny. In Donson, the decades since that broadcast, military veterans and television historians have debated what actually happened that night and what it meant. Some argue that Carson's decision to read the letter was a cynical ratings play, a calculated risk to generate controversy and attention. Others insist it was genuine moral courage, a moment when entertainment bowed to ethics. The truth, as usual, is probably more complicated. Carson was many things: comedian, professional, businessman, human being, and on October 14, 1971, all of those identities collided in a way that produced something unprecedented. He wasn't trying to be brave. He wasn't trying to make a statement. He was simply confronted with truth that demanded to be spoken. And for once, the professional entertainer stepped aside and let the human being take the microphone. Linda Henderson, Michael's mother, watched the broadcast in Modesto and spent the next 30 years giving occasional interviews about her son and that letter. She never blamed Carson for the jokes he'd made before reading the letter, never expressed anger that it took her son's death to make Carson take the war seriously. Instead, she focused on gratitude that Michael's voice was heard, that his doubts and fears were validated on national television, that for 4 minutes the smooth surface of American entertainment cracked open and revealed the wound underneath. In her final interview before her death in 2003, she said something that gets to the heart of why that night still matters. People think entertainment is about escape, about forgetting the bad things. But sometimes entertainment needs to be about remembering. Johnny helped America remember my son. That's all a mother can ask. The letter itself lives on in multiple forms. NBC kept the original in their archives, though legal restrictions prevent its public display. A transcript was published in TV Guide in 1972, though significant portions were redacted. Various unauthorized versions circulated online in the early 2000s, each claiming to be the complete text, but differing in details. What remains undisputed is the impact, how 3 pages of cramped handwriting from a doomed soldier managed to break through the carefully constructed wall between entertainment and reality, between comedy and tragedy, between Johnny Carson the professional and Johnny Carson the man. In the final years of his life, Carson rarely gave interviews and never discussed the Henderson letter publicly. But in 2004, a year before his death, he agreed to speak with journalist Bob Costas for what would be one of his last on-camera appearances. Costas asked about defining moments in Carson's career, the biggest laughs, the best guests, the nights everything clicked perfectly. Carson answered politely, but without much enthusiasm, until Costas mentioned October 1971. Then Carson went quiet for a long moment before saying, "That was the night I realized I'd been hiding for 9 years, hiding behind jokes, behind the desk, behind Ed's laugh. Michael Henderson's letter forced me to stop hiding, and I've spent every day since then trying to figure out if I'm brave enough to stay visible." He paused, looked directly at the camera with that same intensity he'd had reading the letter 33 years earlier, and said, "I don't think I ever figured it out. But at least for 4 minutes, I tried. And maybe that's all anyone can do. Try, fail, try again." Michael deserved more than that. They all deserved more. But it's what I had to give. 20 million people watched Johnny Carson read that letter on October 14, 1971. Most of them are gone now, or old enough that the memory has faded into the general blur of television watched over a lifetime. But for those who remember, for the veterans who felt seen, for the families who felt heard, for the viewers who witnessed the mask crack and reveal the man underneath, that night remains singular, not because it was entertaining, not because it was comfortable, but because it was true, and truth in entertainment is rare enough to be treasured when it breaks through. Michael James Henderson wrote 3 pages that changed television history. Johnny Carson read them and changed himself. And for 4 minutes and 17 seconds, America stopped laughing and started listening. That's the legacy. Not the jokes, not the ratings, not the perfect monologues that made millions laugh. The legacy is the moment when Johnny Carson chose truth over entertainment and discovered that sometimes the most important thing you can give an audience isn't escape, but acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that their pain is real, their questions matter, and the comfortable lies we tell ourselves are sometimes less valuable than the uncomfortable truths we need to hear.